Good morning, everyone. I'm in school this morning, as you can see, because we have our food bank. And so I thought I'd come in and do the reading from the conference room next to my office. And for those of you who've been following along, you will know that we are now in 1933. We've seen the ramping up of problems for the Jewish people. We've seen that prejudice starting to come out in German society, and what we will see now is things slowly deteriorate for the Schneider family as Friedrich grows up, and how he starts to come to terms with the new reality that he finds in Nazi Germany. So on page 44, and the chapter we're going to read is called Herr Schneider, 1933. We sat at the car house. Friedrich was explaining the math problems. I hadn't paid any attention in class, and I didn't pay attention to Friedrich either. With my shoe, I pushed a rock to and fro on the pavement. Friedrich worked out the sums with such concentration that he didn't notice I was listening. But he jumped when I kicked the rock hard, and he followed it with his eyes. I tried to make out what fascinated him so. There wasn't a thing to be seen. The street was empty. Far off, a single man walked. Slowly, he came closer. Is that my father? Friedrich asked softly. I looked once more at the man in the distance. No, I said, your father walks faster. And anyway, it's too early. He can't have finished work yet. Friedrich didn't answer. His eyes followed every movement of the approaching man. The man carried a briefcase by the handle. His head hung on his chest, a hat shaded his face. The man dragged his feet. Sometimes he stopped, hesitated. Then he turned toward a garden gate. Half a step away from it, he wavered and veered towards the street again. He's drunk, I said. Well, it's my father after all, Friedrich cried out, leaping up and running towards the swaying man. I sat on, not trusting Friedrich's eyes. I saw how Friedrich stopped short just before he reached the man, and then he took his arm. The man didn't. Seems that there was some connection error there, so I'll just read that little bit again. Tears ran down his face. He did not wipe off the tears. They rolled onto his jacket and left a damp trail. Herr Schneider wept. I had never seen a man cry before. Friedrich and his father disappeared into the house. Anna shook her head. Suddenly she collapsed onto one of our kitchen chairs. She threw her arms on the table, laid her face in them and cried, loudly and violently. The sobs shook her body, and they didn't stop again. They didn't stop. Again and again she stammered. I am afraid. I am so afraid. One could barely make out the words. My mother had turned in alarm when Frau Schneider collapsed on our kitchen table. And now she asked no questions and said nothing further. From the furthest corner of the kitchen cupboard, she took the strictly guarded can of real coffee beans. She ground the beans and after rinsing it with hot water, put 6 heaped teaspoons into the little coffee pot, which held only 3 cups. Frau Schneider still sobbed. Her tears made a small puddle on the wax tablecloth. Mother brewed up the coffee by pouring boiling water on the ground beans, and while the grounds settled to the bottom of the pot, she fetched a bottle of brandy. This brandy, at father's request, was only used for serious illnesses. Mother opened the bottle, she poured the coffee and added a large portion of brandy. Frau Schneider noticed none of this. In between her sobs we heard more unintelligible scraps of words. My mother took a kitchen chair and sat down close to Frau Schneider. She lifted her head and dabbed her face, and then she gently forced the strong hot coffee laced with brandy down her throat in spoonfuls. It took a long time for Frau Schneider to calm down. And finally she got hold of herself. With a damp cloth which Mother handed her, she cooled her tear-reddened eyes. Please forgive me, she whispered. I am so upset. Mother shook her head. She stroked Frau Schneider's hair. Why don't you tell me about it? It will ease your burden. Frau Schneider nodded, and again tears came to her eyes. After a while, she said so softly one could hardly catch the words, "My husband has been fired." My mother stared at her stupidly. Frau Schneider did not return the glance. She looked down at the wax tablecloth. "But your husband is a civil servant, isn't he?" asked my mother. Frau Schneider agreed. "I thought civil servants couldn't be fired." Frau Schneider didn't reply. Did he do something stupid?" Mother asked. Frau Schneider shook her head. More tears ran down her face. "They forced him to retire," she finally said. "At 32. "But why?" Mother asked. Frau Schneider lifted her head. For a long time she looked at Mother with her cried-out eyes, saying nothing. Then she said, emphasizing each word, "We are Jews, aren't we?" The hearing, 1933. The judge held up the document. Resch versus Schneider. He called into the court chamber, and then he absorbed himself in the papers in front of him. An attorney in a wide robe opened the swinging door leading to the witness box. With his eyes, he directed Herr Resch out of the public portion of the courtroom and to the witness box. Herr Schneider stepped alone to the judge's table and waited. If it weren't for his constantly trembling fingers, one would have considered him calm. Herr Resch's attorney placed himself opposite Herr Schneider. The judge looked up and quietly instructed the court stenographer about what to take down. After he'd done this, he turned to the attorney. "Counsellor," he addressed him, "I missed the legal argument behind your submitted writ of complaint. You move on behalf of... Under the statute covering civil suits, we are required to settle the matter as a dispute as quickly as possible. If you go back so far into the past, I fear we will need several days. I must therefore ask you to present the facts briefly." Pretending to be conscience-stricken, the attorney lowered his head until his chin touched his chest, and then he leaned back again, tugged at his robe, and began afresh. I watched, excited. I'd never been in a courtroom before. Mother clung to my hand. It was a new experience for her too. Herr Schneider had asked us to come, just in case. In the seat next to Mother crouched Frau Schneider. Her whole body trembled, she was so nervous. Friedrich sat close to her, eyes wide with fear. He looked in turn at his father, the judge, and the attorney. "For a year now," the attorney was saying, "my client has been a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party of our highly revered Chancellor of the German Reich, Adolf Hitler." At these words, the attorney had snapped to attention and clicked his heels together. And then he resumed his old position and continued to talk. "My client believes with all his heart in the philosophy of the Nazi Party and is convinced of the correctness of its teachings." He stepped back, let go of his robe, and pointed an admonishing index finger at the courtroom ceiling. Waving his hand in the air, he continued, "And a substantial part of the National Socialist ideology consists of the rejection of Judaism, Your Honour." As if he were duelling, he set one foot forward and pointed at Herr Schneider. He raised his voice, "Your Honour, the defendant is a Jew." The attorney fell silent. The judge looked at the attorney, then at Herr Schneider, and finally at the public. The attorney began again. In a voice that sounded as if it would break, he imploringly called into the courtroom, "Can my client be expected to keep as a tenant in his house someone whom, according to the basic principles of his party, he must regard as an affliction to his nation, as a constant threat of danger. My client feels the presence of a Jew in his house constitutes a continuous strain upon the provisions of the tenant protection law. We therefore move that the accused..." The judge lifted a finger. "Defendant, if you please, counsellor," he corrected. "The defendant." Looking contrite, the attorney admitted his error. "Of course, Your Honour, the defendant. I ask your forgiveness." He took a deep breath and continued in an even louder voice than before. "We therefore move that the defendant be instructed to vacate the apartment he now inhabits, and that he further be ordered to pay the costs of this hearing." The judge motioned to the court stenographer, and then he turned to Herr Schneider. "And what is your response?" Frau Schneider moved restlessly back and forth in her seat. Beside her, Friedrich sat stiffly upright. Behind us, some spectators whispered to each other. Mother squeezed my hand still harder. In a firm voice, Herr Schneider replied, "I move that the case be dismissed. The plaintiff has always known that I am a Jew. Until a short time ago, he found nothing wrong with that." The judge bent slightly forward. "How long have you lived in the house of the plaintiff?" he asked. "For about 10 years, was Herr Schneider's reply. Looking at the attorney, the judge inquired, "Does the defendant speak the truth?" The attorney tried to catch Herr Resch's eye. "Is this true?" he asked. Puffing, Herr Resch got up and walked to the front of the courtroom. Johann Resch, he continued, introduced himself to the judge. "I am the plaintiff." The stenographer took down his name. "And what do you say about this?" the judge asked. Herr Resch folded his hands over his chest, gasped for air and began, "I am a convinced National Socialist. On personal effort, I want to help accomplish the party's goals. Prevent party friends from visiting me, but not only party friends will stay away, my business friends will not come either. Your Honour, this Jew will ruin my... Every reader of our party newspaper, Der Stürmer, knows about the devastating effect of the Jews on our economy." The judge interrupted Herr Resch. "Just a moment, please. Refrain from giving political speeches, please. Limit yourself to the case at hand. My question is still unanswered. Has the defendant lived in your house for 10 years, as he says? And have you always known he is a Jew?" Herr Resch stepped closer to the judge's table. "Yes, but you know it was different then. Times have changed. Now I cannot tolerate a Jew in my house." The judge waved this aside and said to Herr Resch, "Since you became a member of the NSDAP, you cannot tolerate a Jew in your house. Can you assure me that in the near future you may not join a party which is against Catholics or vegetarians? If I accede to your claim today, you may stand before me in a year or two and demand a verdict against another tenant because he is Catholic or doesn't eat meat." Herr Resch shook his head. "But that's something quite different." At this, the attorney gripped his sleeve and pulled him aside. The two spoke together in hushed voices. Herr Resch gesticulated. His attorney kept trying to calm him down. The judge looked out of the window. The spectators were talking. Frau Schneider dabbed drops of sweat from her brow. Friedrich stroked her arm. And finally, the attorney walked to the judge's table and Herr Resch left the courtroom. My client has empowered me to retract his claim," he declared. "He will bear the costs." With a bang, the judge closed the folder from the pile in front of me, picked up a new one and prepared to call the next two parties. Herr Schneider bowed to the judge. All at once, Friedrich cried out. Frau Schneider put her hand over his mouth. Everyone looked at us. The judge took off his glasses and his eyes searched the courtroom. "What was that?" he asked. "My son," Herr Schneider answered. "Come here, my boy," the judge called. Herr Schneider collected Friedrich and led him to the judge's table. Friedrich was still crying. "Why are you crying, huh?" the judge asked warmly. "You don't have to worry. Nothing will happen to you. That's why I am here, to see that justice is done." Friedrich wiped his eyes and said, "You?" "Yes." So in this particular chapter, we see the irrationality of the Socialist Workers' Party hatred of the Jewish people. And we see how the judge contradicts this argument by saying, well, if it's Jews today, why not Catholics tomorrow? And we see through history periods of persecution for people depending on their faith, depending on their race, depending on their geography, depending on all sorts of things. But never is it a fair or equitable way to solve things. And usually where we see this type of prejudice, it's about scapegoating for other problems, to deflect and look at as fine as that. "Where did you get it?" I asked. Friedrich laughed, then took my hand and led me down the street. "Where are you going?" I asked, and pulled my hand away. "Come and see," he said. "I'll show you something. You'll be amazed." Curious, I followed. We crossed the Ringstrasse, wound our way through a narrow alley, and came back to the market square. Friedrich pressed forward, not giving me time to glance in the store windows. We left the square through the arcade and turned into the main street. Grinning, Friedrich greeted the man outside the district council building with "Heil Hitler!" Standing at attention, the man returned the greeting. Then we entered the Herschel Mayer department store through the main entrance. A man in a blue coat and blue cap with silver braid dangling from his shoulders tore open the door and bowed low to us. The lights of the enormous chandelier on the main floor were multiplied many times over in the mirrors around the walls, and at our approach, the saleswoman stood up and expectantly behind their tables. Friedrich would not let himself be distracted. Sure of his destination, he steered me toward the up escalator. In one bound, he leapt on and motioned me to follow. I placed my feet carefully. When I had a secure footing on the moving steps, I climbed after him. But before I could catch up, Friedrich was already on the second escalator. He was waiting for me beneath the sign, "Third floor, toys." He took my hand and led me to a spot where I could overlook the whole department. "Now, what do you see?" he asked proudly. I peered around me. Everywhere were tables laden with toys, building blocks, rocking horses, drums, dolls, roller skates and bicycles. In the midst of all stood the saleswoman. A few customers wandered among the tables and were being waited on. A gentleman in a black frock coat and grey striped trousers strolled up and down. Here he instructed a saleswoman. There he put a toy back in its proper place. "I don't know," I said. "Come, I'll help you," Friedrich said, grabbing my shoulder. Past dolls' carriages, hoops and metal boats, he pulled me along until we stood close behind the gentleman in the black frock coat. Something about the gentleman struck me as familiar. Suddenly, Friedrich coughed. The gentleman turned around. It was Herr Schneider. Herr Schneider laughed, seized Friedrich's elbows and lifted him up, and then he said hello to me and asked, "Well, whom do you like better? The post office official Schneider or the department head?" Hesitantly, I said, "You look so elegant." Herr Schneider laughed again. "I, for one, like myself better this way." He rubbed his hands, and then he piloted us through the tables to a vast platform. The platform was one enormous train set. Rails led over mountains and through valleys. Several trains could turn at the same time and stop one after the other at the toy station. Herr Schneider explained how it all worked, then let us play with the trains. He stood and watched. Friedrich controlled the freight trains. I took over the express trains. We almost had a collision, but Herr Schneider prevented it. When I was attaching a car, he asked me out of the blue, "How is the young Volk?" I looked at Friedrich. Friedrich told me everything, Herr Schneider explained. And I replied, "I like it. We're going on a real trip soon. Maybe I'll be allowed to go. I'm already saving money. It'll be great. We'll sleep in tents and cook our own food. I wish Friedrich could join us." Herr Schneider looked into the distance and focused on something. He nodded imperceptibly. In a near whisper, he said, "A pity. But I guess it's better so." Silently, Friedrich and I played on. Herr Schneider walked up and down behind us, and suddenly he asked another question. "What does your father say about the Jungvolk?" I turned around. "Father is glad I like it in the Jungvolk. He makes sure I go on duty regularly and punctually, especially since he joined the party." Herr Schneider looked at me, frightened. "Take care of the bill. Please, Fräulein Ewert, guide the gentleman." Fräulein Ewert nodded, smiling. Herr Schneider shook hands. "Auf Wiedersehen, boys, and have fun." Slowly he walked away. At the fourth table, he turned and waved. But he was no longer smiling. So it's quite a significant moment in the story here where we see that the Richters have now joined the party. And they join the party, obviously out of desperation, because they think that it will help them economically or to move forward with their lives. But what happens is they're now being sucked into that dangerous ideology, even though they don't believe in it. And they're friends with the Schneiders. So this, perhaps you can start to begin to see how views can be warped and corrupted, and people can be drawn in even when they don't want to. So we'll leave it there for today, and we'll carry on with our reading tomorrow with the teacher. We move into a new year, 1934, and it'll be interesting to see what happens as we move forward. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a good day. Enjoy your studies. Take care now.